All right, today we're jumping into a really high-stakes story. It's about power, it's about fear, and it's about a geopolitical strategy that could either keep a paradise safe or cause the whole thing to come crashing down. This is a story about Gulliver's strings and one very, very dangerous gamble. So, here's the game plan. We'll kick things off with what happens when a real crisis hits. Then we'll look at the first big crack in the US-Europe partnership over Kosovo. After that, we'll see how 9/11 just changed everything, leading to Europe's pretty clever counter-strategy. And finally, we'll unpack the ultimate gamble that's being made right now. Okay, so to really get what's going on here, you have to wrap your head around this one key metaphor. The idea of Europe as this peaceful, beautiful garden living right next door to a chaotic, dangerous jungle, a jungle that's mostly kept at bay by American power. And this is where you see this massive split in how they see the world. The source we're looking at argues that Europe sees itself as a kind of Kantian Paradise, right? A place governed by laws and cooperation. But the US, it has to live in a Hobbesian world, a reality where it's raw power, not just rules, that keeps the real dangers out. But what happens when that bear from the jungle actually pounces? When a real crisis hits? Well, that's when the man with the knife, Europe, and the man with the gun, America, are forced to face just how different they are. And that's when their paths start to split. The first major stress test for this whole alliance came back in the 1990s, with the conflict in Kosovo. Now, this wasn't some faraway problem. This was happening right in Europe's own backyard. And according to the source, it turned into a moment of, well, deep humiliation. So picture this. It's 1999. Ethnic cleansing is happening on the European continent. And the world is looking at Europe thinking, okay, do something. This was supposed to be the moment they proved their paradise was strong enough on its own. The thing is, while Europe absolutely had the will to stop the atrocities, they pretty quickly realized they just didn't have the military muscle. We're talking a lack of high-tech aircraft, the logistics, the precision weapons needed to get the job done. At the end of the day, they had to pick up the phone and call Washington for help. And you can imagine, this started to build some real resentment on the American side. From their perspective, they were doing all the heavy lifting, flying the huge majority of the missions, while their European allies were acting like backseat drivers, constantly trying to micromanage the mission with worries about legal procedures. So, if Kosovo was a crack in the foundation, well, 9/11 was the earthquake that just blew the whole thing apart. For the United States, foreign policy wasn't some abstract debate anymore. Suddenly, it was about one thing and one thing only: survival. We're talking about nearly 3,000 people killed on American soil. That number, it changes everything. This wasn't a distant conflict in someone else's backyard. This was a direct attack at home. That whole metaphor we talked about, the garden and the jungle, all of a sudden, it wasn't a metaphor anymore. The beasts from that Hobbesian jungle hadn't just rattled the fence. They had jumped right over the wall and dragged the chaos of the world into the garden. And America's response was, well, it was a complete 180. They basically adopted this new doctrine, unilateralism. All that careful diplomacy was gone. The new message was blunt and it was simple. We are going after them. If you want to help, great. If not, get out of our way. And you know what? This absolutely terrified Europe. Because all of a sudden, their fear wasn't just about terrorists like Al-Qaeda or dictators like Saddam Hussein. They were now deeply, deeply afraid of their own protector. This American giant that was wounded, enraged, and seemed to have broken free of every single chain. So what's Europe to do? They can't match the US militarily, that's obvious. So they came up with this really clever, kind of subtle counterattack, a strategy that the source calls Gulliver's strings. I mean, that was the big question facing European leaders, right? How do you, a collective of smaller powers, control a single, unbound superpower? You don't take it on head-to-head. You find a way to tie it down. So they started almost obsessively weaving this incredibly complex web of international laws, treaties, and procedures through institutions like the UN. The whole idea wasn't to defeat the giant in a fight, but to tie it down with thousands and thousands of tiny, legal threads until it just couldn't move freely anymore. So on the surface, this idea of multilateralism sounds great, doesn't it? It's all about world peace. But the source we're looking at argues that the real goal was something totally different, that it was actually a strategic, power-grabbing movement to give weaker nations a way to control the world's only superpower. And that brings us right up to today. to the massive, high-stakes gamble at the very heart of this whole strategy. A gamble that comes with a really stark warning. From the American point of view, there's this growing sense of, just deep ingratitude. They see themselves standing guard on the wall, protecting the garden from the jungle, but the whole time they're getting criticized by the very people they're protecting for not being elegant enough while doing it.
So Europe is essentially pushing all its chips to the center of the table. They're betting everything on the idea that the world itself has fundamentally changed. They're gambling that hard power doesn't matter anymore, that the beasts in the jungle have all become vegetarians, and that a piece of paper, international law, is strong enough to stop a dictator.
But what if they're wrong? What if that whole bet is just flat out wrong? What happens if the American giant, tired of being tied down, tired of being criticized, finally just gets fed up, drops its gun, and walks away from the wall? In that world, that carefully built Kantian Paradise is suddenly left all alone, totally exposed to the harsh Hobbesian jungle. And as our source warns, if you deliberately cut the pillar of power that's holding up your paradise, how long can you really expect that paradise to last? It's a question that just hangs over everything, and there is no easy answer.